I like jobs where things are undefined. I like jobs when someone says, here is just like a ball of string, like make something out of this. And I am so happy when you do that. And the minute it's like an organized thing, I'm like, oh, I'm a little bit bored now because this is just like a self-operating machine. I just kind of have to show up and like shake some hands. And I think for most people, that's when they would be the happiest. That's when I'm the most bored.
You know, they say women shouldn't be bossy.
We're out here reclaiming that word. What's so wrong with being the boss? Bossy.
Welcome back to the Bossy Show. We have a very special guest in the house with us today. We have Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. She is the CEO and co-founder of a tech nonprofit, which I feel like are two words I do not hear together very often.
Sounds good, though.
It does sound good. Called Humane Intelligence. So she works on creating ethical AI systems, and her list of credentials and accolades and awards is about a mile long. So
she's kind of a badass.
Yeah, I would say more than kind of.
I think we first learned about you in a magazine. So like she's in magazines, she's on lists, she's on all kinds of. Can you give us a couple?
BBC's 100 Women. So that's casual. Bay Area Top 40 Under 40, a member of the British Royal Society of the Arts, named by Forbes as one of 5 who are shaping AI. So that's pretty cool. And the first thing that jumped out at me, Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, was the director of machine learning ethics, transparency, and accountability at Twitter. Which if you know anything, if you've been following the Twitter news, you know that there was a lot of tumult when the ownership changed at that company. And so before we even get into the meaty stuff, I am just dying to know, Rumman, what that was like and what happened to you at Twitter.
I'll start at the end where most of us got fired, myself included. Nobody would be surprised, right? I don't think Elon Musk's politics and vision for the company aligns with what people like myself do. Yeah. And to be honest, I had told my team from months before when it was first announced that if he did actually take over, I was not going to stay at the company. I believe really strongly in if you're working for a company, you're working for the leadership. And if I don't believe in what leadership is doing, then I wouldn't work there. So unsurprisingly, we were all fired, which I had predicted anyway. But, your question's really good. Like, what was that last year like? It taught me or reminded me about how fragile culture really is. Twitter, the company before Elon, was a place with an amazing culture. It genuinely was full of people who tried their best to solve really hard problems, right? And it's not to say, like, definitely we would be the first to admit when we didn't get something right. That was actually one of the things that drew me to the company is they were willing to like show all their flaws. They're like, yep, you're right. We have no idea. We didn't do this right. We're trying to fix it. This is hard. And I think that's great because when you're trying to tackle ethics, you have to have that mindset of trying your best and like in a space that's really unknown and knowing that you will sometimes fail, but then being able and willing to be humble about it and recover. It was just a reminder that how fragile culture is. Within less than a year, just the shadow of him taking over decimated the culture. It became very secretive, very closed. Nobody was sharing anything with anybody anymore. Everybody was really scared of what was going to happen when he came in. And it kind of, people kind of showed their true colors. I think there were some people who stood up and they're like, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to take this. I'm going to make sure my team is okay and we're all going to leave. And there were some people who were okay with just quietly accepting what was going to happen.
One of the things I think you really learn from having different roles and having different jobs, sometimes you learn things that you want to replicate and want to do, particularly if you leave afterwards and become an entrepreneur. You learn things you want to do similarly. And sometimes the biggest thing you learn from a job is what not to do. Like what you don't want to replicate as an entrepreneur in your own business. So like what were some of the things that maybe I want to hear a little bit more about, first of all, what your job was, because I don't really know anybody who has a ethics, transparency, and accountability role at a tech company. So maybe tell us like what that job was, and then also what you learned you wanted to do and not do, because then you transitioned eventually to entrepreneurship, so what you learned. But first, maybe tell us what the role was.
Yeah. And to make it even more confusing, I was an engineering director. So you're like, how do you do engineering around ethics? It's a great
Yeah.
question. So I ran a hybrid team. It was engineers and researchers. So much of the field of responsible AI is translating concepts or aspirations or visions into things that are technical. So if I say I want my model to not be racist, great. How do you have to go and measure that? So there are all these ways that we've come up with, looking at inspecting the data, looking at the algorithm itself, looking at the output of the algorithm, how people are using it. So we made these approaches and we actually integrated them into the Twitter technical architecture. There was some of our work that the public saw, and that was that things like how we audited our own model. So for example, we looked at our recommendation algorithm versus the reverse chronological. So, Twitter has like two feeds. There's one the algorithm gives you, the one that's just sort of reverse time order. And we looked at whether or not the algorithm was amplifying certain types of political content. And we found that in 7 out of 8 Western democracies, it actually did show a slight preference for center-right content. And we wrote a lot about it. We have a whole paper. It was published publicly. We had shared some of our data so the researchers could replicate it. But that was kind of a really big finding. And, kind of back to what I said about how much I love the culture of Twitter. How many companies do you know would be willing to do that? Would be willing to say, not only do I want you to do this work, I will, we are fine with you publicly posting it and sharing the data about it. That's very special.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense about what you were doing. This show is called Bossy. We talk about being a boss. So I'm curious what you learned, one thing you got that you wanted to do more of from that role once you got into entrepreneurship, and one thing that you were like, I don't want to do that again. Or replicate.
I really love solving problems and building things, and Twitter really let me do that. So in my new role and what I do with Humane Intelligence, I've decided the thing I want to do is just solve problems. I think there's a lot of admiring the problem that can happen in this field. And I think there's a lot of fear of tackling things that are nearly impossible to do, right? So if you say AI is racist, how do I make it not racist? It's actually really scary to tackle because your answer is not going to be perfect. Someone's going to pop up, it's always the people who don't do the work who pop up and are the first to point out the flaws. And you have to develop a really thick skin. And let me tell you, at Twitter, you develop a thick skin because it's not just that someone's going to say something. Yeah. All of Twitter says something to you, to your account right away. Oh. And sometimes it's just, people who love to hate. But other times it literally, I more than once would have Hindu right-wing activists harass me on my own account. So sometimes it legitimately is harassment. So you kind of develop a thick skin for it. But also, it's kind of addicting to solve really hard problems. Yeah. So my goal in everything I'm doing now is I'm okay with problems being big and undefined and difficult to answer, because that is more interesting to me than the thing we know. And in terms of the what you don't want to do, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this on a podcast, I got really tired of doing lots of kind of rote meetings. I was a people manager. At the end of the day, yes, we did all this exciting work, but I was a people manager, right? Yeah. So if you're a people manager, you don't always get to do the hands-on stuff. And I loved doing a bit of both. But I also realized that I had to sacrifice the constant treadmill of meetings. And, what I don't want to do in any position that I'm in, either of, that I've built or in organizations that I've made, or even in any future jobs I may have, I just don't want to sit in meetings all day. I can't. Yeah. I die a little inside.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm curious too. So something that's really interesting, I kind of alluded to it when we first started chatting about how I rarely hear tech nonprofit. And something that you said in an interview with Digital Future Society really jumped out at us. You said that we need values that are not driven on profitability, but on human flourishing, right? And what is best for society. So I'm curious if you think that making society-altering technology a for-profit enterprise is actually detrimental to long-term success and growth. You obviously chose this nonprofit model for a reason, but this is a very quickly exploding field. There's a lot of people trying to stake their ground. I think people see dollar signs in this world, and I'm curious what made you go the opposite direction and go, no, actually, going that way is gonna lead to worse outcomes.
I'm going to do a nonprofit instead of a for-profit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two parts to it. One is actually that one thing I've learned. So I had a startup before I joined Twitter, and functionally speaking, raising and running a nonprofit is actually nearly identical to a for-profit, right? So
interesting.
With a startup, you have to go get venture capitalists to give you seed funding, et cetera. With a nonprofit, I go to foundation. So, either they fund specific projects or they give you operational funding. But in a sense, it's kind of similar, right? I have to go out, I have to pitch to either VCs or funders in some fashion. They have to be mission aligned. They have to understand what I'm doing. So that same kind of communication style. And there is an accountability mechanism. They're just slightly different. So rather than accountable, so the thing about running a startup that I think a lot of people who are young and super enthusiastic and this idea of entrepreneurship being freedom is a little bit of a lie. So the way it's kind of a lie is I think people get really caught up in how sexy the numbers sound. $10 million raise, $20 million raise. But that money was not just handed for nothing. It was handed to them in return for ownership of the company.
Yep.
So every dollar you take is something you're giving away. And it's very hard as a for-profit, if you are like a little less experienced, people will sell off their company for way cheaper than they should. And what they don't realize later is that these VCs want to see a return on that profit. So then you're getting pressured for something called ARR, which your listeners probably know what that is, right? So you're getting pressured for revenue. Well, revenue may take a little bit longer if your mission is social impact. It's not to say it's impossible, right? I've worked in industry. If I didn't believe it were possible, I wouldn't have worked in industry. But I think the closest pathway, especially in the current environment, between solving problems that are the problems of society and with the tech we have today, the closest path is actually through a nonprofit that's a little bit more tech oriented. Now, like a few years ago when I started my startup, the nonprofit space didn't really do tech. Like you started off in the beginning by saying we don't usually hear these words, tech and nonprofit. And that's true. So there are tech nonprofits, but they're like policy organizations. They write papers, they do convenings, they raise awareness, which is all super important. But now we're in a space where the community is aware, like we get it, right? Everyone's like, yep, I'm being surveilled. My data is being stolen. Algorithms are racist. Like we are very aware. But what do I do?
Yeah.
So I think a part of that was waiting for the foundations to almost be ready to be in the space of saying, okay, well, now we need to build. And I'm good at building, so it was more appropriate for me. But another part that's really important to your question is, obviously, I'm not the first person to point out that how for-profit industries are structured is sometimes misaligned with broader social goals, right?
Yeah.
And even like major capitalists have pointed this out, right? The CEO of Panera literally left his job because he said that, that I want to figure out alternative methods of having a successful, profitable organization that doesn't require me sucking every last dollar out of somebody or cutting corners or being cheap. And we have some examples, like Patagonia is a great example of a company that is really ethical and really responsible in their practices, but also makes a lot of money. So cracking that formula is kind of important. It's why we have things like B Corps, but some of those almost fight against the way, especially as a startup, right? Like Patagonia is huge now. They can throw their weight around. If you're just some kid and you raise some money for a startup and there's all this competition, which you've mentioned, totally correct, it's very hard for you, especially when you're getting pressure from the VCs to say, maybe I won't do a contract with this company that's doing this unethical practice or doing this terrible thing, or I won't sell my customers' data, because that's one more dollar you're not getting.
Yep.
Did you ever consider a for-profit route, or was that completely off the table for you? Like that was it wasn't a hard decision for you to make. You already knew that was what you were going to do.
It was not a hard decision for me to make, but because I had done it once before.
Yeah.
And what I is, most investors are actually pretty conservative, right? They want to invest in things that they know will make money. And it's pretty hard for people to really put money behind things that sound absolutely wild. So what I'm building with Humane Intelligence is an open source, open science platform for anybody to access and evaluate AI models. That just sounds kind of wild, because then your first question is like, so how do you make money, right? And I'm like, I don't know, I'll figure that out later. And that's not something VCs want to really hear. I think the other part of it is it's really hard to, one of the things that frustrated me with doing a startup was investors are really focused in the now, what's selling now, what's working now. And if you're truly building a company, especially thinking through something like ethical AI, which is so unknown and very vague, the easy way to do it would be to say, oh, you're going to make something about compliance with the law. Like, boring. I don't want to do that. That's really, I mean, plenty of people do. Like, it's great. There's lots of money to be made in compliance.
Yeah.
I just don't want to do it. I want to build towards human flourishing, which is by definition not something easily marketable, right?
This is so interesting to me as well, though, because like I think of myself, I tend to lean to being a for-profit thinker first. And I'm thinking like if you were at Twitter, for example, pre-Elon, right? You were at Twitter working there, and there was a need, there was an interest in hiring a team to make sure that the algorithm and the work they were doing was ethical. So I would imagine that there are companies out there that do have an interest in having teams and then tools, right? Tools that you make to support that. So I'm sort of hearing you, I almost want to dig a little bit more, because I'm hearing you kind of say like, of course it would be nonprofit, but I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who have these missions, right? Things that they want to do in the world, which I hear this so clearly, and like how you're talking about how like important your mission is to you. I love this. And I think that they could be wondering like, okay, well, I could go and I could fund myself by, for example, getting contracts with companies like Twitter pre-Elon, right? Who has a clear need for this, and saying, I'm going to build tools for them to help them do this. And that was kind of a path you chose not to take, right? I'm not going to monetize with businesses by giving them access to our tools or consulting or stuff like that. And so I'm curious if you feel like that would have been, that's a workable business model, like, or do you think people are not ready for it?
No, I think it absolutely is a workable business model. You know, there's a lot of money spent on trust and safety, responsible use, ethical use. I have colleagues and friends I've worked with and still work with at Apple and Microsoft and Google and Amazon. If you look at Microsoft alone, they have a massive Office for Responsible AI. It sits in their legal division, but they also have people who are scientists, who do AI security, who are engineers, who are all kind of tied up in responsible AI. So there's an immense amount of profitability. I just found it a little bit freeing for my mission not to be tied with revenue. Right.
Yeah.
But I will say though, one of the things that I loved about being at a company is I don't necessarily think it is a bad thing to have to prove that the thing you are building is something people will pay for, because that is one measure of how much people value it. It shouldn't be the only measure, right? So there's an upper limit to that where like you can't build anything unless it is profitable. That's a bad space. But I think it's worth a stress test in society to say, would you give me $5 for this?
Yeah.
Would you pay $10 up for a monthly subscription to my app?
Just to see what the market sentiment is about it.
Right. Exactly. Because if everybody says no, then you've not actually built anything that solves anybody's problem. So you just built a thing that you thought solved people's problems.
Well, and it reminds me a little bit of, we're talking about short-term versus long-term thinking. And there are two examples that come to mind. The first is like the first iteration of the internet. I think it was called like the ARPANET or something, but it was largely funded by the federal government, because there was so much R&D that had to go into that. And then, of course, now there are private entities that built on that foundation and became largely profitable, but like the initial work did not have like a go-to-market strategy and we're going to be profitable by Q2. But that's how a lot of this like life-changing, world-changing technology works, is it takes a really long time and it's not going to make any money. And what investor wants to invest in that? You tell me it's going to take 20 years for this to work?
That's right.
No, thank you. So I think that's an element. And then I think we see the opposite side with like a lot of what's been going on with Boeing. And I think it's just like the most beautiful case study of if you have a really short-term mindset, you're really focused on shareholder returns, and you spend, I don't remember the exact figure, but it's like, oh, we're going to spend 7 times as much money on stock buybacks to juice earnings per share as we are on R&D. And now we're all kind of seeing the results of those decisions. So I think it makes perfect sense with what you're saying about kind of that longer term focus and not wanting to be beholden to the short-term mentality of like quarterly earnings.
Yeah, I think also you're kind of pointing out, this conversation is kind of helping me see too, that it's not just like a one answer. So if we're trying to solve the problem of like ethical AI, like all these things happening ethically, it maybe is not like a one model fits all kind of scenario. And even an organization might have multiple different models. Tell me, Rumman, if I have this correct, because I have a little bit of I've never run a nonprofit before. I grew up in a family. My dad was the chief operating officer of a nonprofit of the Urban League, and of the LA Urban League. And so I remember him saying things about running a nonprofit. And I'm curious if this resonates as like true or not true for your experience. So I remember him saying like there's not that much tactically that's different about running a nonprofit versus a for-profit, which is kind of what I heard you say earlier. I think he maybe said it in a slightly different way, because he was sort of thinking about organizations where you're a nonprofit and you get funding, like you get grants and donations, et cetera. But also nonprofits sometimes want to have a revenue generating center as well. You just, at the end of the year, you don't take that profit and distribute it to shareholders. You just reinvest it back. But if you look at, for example, like the Salvation Army or like nonprofits like that, they have a business model. They have stores, people donate things, they sell it, and then they use that money, that revenue, back in to do things for the business. I think they take donations too, or like money donations too, but they've got these two different branches. They take donations, but they also have a revenue generating model. They just put it all back into the business. And so I'm curious if does that also is that true? Is that like true that you see this framework of these two different styles of how nonprofits fund? Do I have that right?
That's exactly right. And I think specifically what you're getting at is every scaled organization basically looks the same. A scaled nonprofit like the Salvation Army looks really similar to a scaled corporation, because you have to do the same basic things. I mean, if we want to be like really radical about it, there's this really great book. I have it on my shelf. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And it actually is about how the nonprofit industrial complex leads to nonprofits being more business-like, which can happen to at a detriment to the groups that they are supposed to be able to be taken care of. It's a really great book, and it's a really great reminder that all of these organizations, they are not inherently wrong or right. There are different institutions with different incentive models.
Right.
So to your question earlier, like I chose an incentive model that is more designed around impact. Now, that sounds nice, but that's just as scary in some sense as frankly, it's easier to chase dollars than to chase, quote, impact. Because an organization's, your funder's definition of impact can change over time, right? So maybe I have built a massive organization around, feeding people who are hungry. And I'm like, here's how many people we fed. And then they may say something like, yes, but what about thing X, which is maybe what I'm interested in now, right? So it's a little scary. And your dad is absolutely right? You have to kind of understand the trends. You have to understand what is important to the foundations and funders. You have to be in the mix. It's actually like almost identical to running a startup. So you're totally correct.
And how do you currently measure success for yourself and for your business, your nonprofit?
Yeah, so fortunately, it actually helps coming from a for-profit background and trying to build a nonprofit. One way I've seen nonprofits falter when they try to scale is that these are people with really good hearts who are really good at helping the community that they've been working with. They don't know how to run a business. Yeah. And people don't realize that you're actually running a business when you're a nonprofit. So I've actually spent a lot of time thinking through KPIs. I think it's really important, especially to show value to funders, but also just to keep track of whether or not we're doing what we say we do. So we're really focused on diversity. So when we do one of our events, we have opt-in where people can capture data and information, about who they are, where they're from, socioeconomic status, that kind of thing. I want to address the diversity of learner in terms of like how new they are to the field of AI. So it's really important to me that we bring new people into this field. So I try to capture that by understanding how many years of experience they have working in responsible AI specifically, if any. We try to partner with, again, to improve diversity, we partner with organizations that have social impact missions, but they're not technical organizations. So This could be a group like the Vera Institute for Justice that focus on criminal justice and helping people who are currently incarcerated retain their rights. So if I do a project with them, that to me counts as a win for diversity. We're also trying to go for geographic diversity. So impact has many different ways. I've sort of thought through what KPIs are for impact. And that to me is a successful organization.
Do you tell your donors and funders what the KPIs are about what you define as success? Or do they ever come to you and say, like, here's what we define as success?
I think sometimes I'm too good of a student. No, I'm laughing because I absolutely approach this from like a startup mindset.
Yeah.
So my startup mindset was like, you have to build out clear rubric for APIs. I send out quarterly reports that are like 5 to 10 pages long. My last quarterly report was like 14 pages long.
Yeah.
So I like do too much homework. I think maybe hopefully my funders like it. I think they are not necessarily used to people showing up with this full on report with the pie charts and the whole, like, here's our annual goals split up into quarters. And honestly, like I said, I do it for myself. There's no point in doing anything unless it is actually helping the world. Like, why would I do this? I could go and get a job making $1 million a year at like whatever, OpenAI or Google or Amazon or something. So if I'm going to go do this, I'm going to go do this right.
I love that little flex. That was so good. I mean,
I'm gonna go make $1 million.
I could, but I'm not.
Wait, but on that note, that is something that I feel like is it's kind of a common, I don't want to say misconception because I don't think it's necessarily a misconception, but something that I have long heard about the nonprofit world in general is that people will get upset if people who work for a nonprofit make a lot of money. And I'm curious that you're in that role and you're coming from a world where you probably were making a lot of money, or if you were to re-enter the for-profit space, you could make a lot of money. How do you think about that as a leader of a nonprofit and perhaps the optics that your donors or the people that are funding you might have while still like attracting and retaining top talent? Because
and also paying yourself what you deserve because you're grinding still.
Yeah.
Right.
You've kind of highlighted how similar it is.
Yeah, I have no easy answer for that question. I think mission really draws people, but I hate the idea of people can't eat missions, right? You can't pay your rent with a mission. That's very real. My mortgage, my mortgage does not care about my KPIs about diversity, right? They take US dollars and US dollars only. Yes. That's a great question. I don't have a good answer for you, to be honest, unfortunately. So I'm fortunately in a space where I give speaking engagements. I actually don't pay myself at all out of my nonprofit.
Oh, wow.
I am in a position where I can do that. And I hate that the world is constructed so that you have to be somebody who's able to do that before you're able to engage in like philanthropy, nonprofit development, right? So, I wish I had an easy answer. In terms of hiring, I'm actually benefiting from the fact that tech has had so many layoffs. Yeah. So we just put out a job description for a partner coordinator. We got about 80 or 90 applications without even really trying. We posted it once on LinkedIn. That's it. We did not, and I think we posted in a couple of Slack channels, and that was it. And we've just gotten, it's not only the number, but also the quality. I'm getting people who left jobs at Meta, at Google, et cetera, or they're at big consulting firms. So they are, I think a lot of people, it speaks to people who, like me, are builders and want to solve problems, but don't necessarily get the space to do that at a for-profit organization. I think some of them are willing to take a bit of a pay cut. That being said, I think the model that works for a lot of people is they open an LLC, an independent consultancy, and I'm fine. Like, I bring on people who work for 20 hours a week, 30 hours a week, or whatever, and they can have multiple gigs. For some people, that actually makes them, if you're willing to do the hustle, you can probably make more doing that than you would working for a company. Yeah. And you can pick and choose what you do. But you definitely have to have the hustle. You have to stay on top of your finances. Like, you cannot dodge the IRS.
Yeah.
You gotta get all your, there's a lot of logistics that companies would take care of for you. But I think for some people, it actually works out better. So I found a lot of success bringing on contractors.
Yeah. This is something I learned, I was surprised about learning in entrepreneurship, was that I think I assumed that I was not going to be able to get top tier talent. And I think the reality is if you can just be a reasonable amount of inspiring. You're working on something inspiring that people can get excited about, and you can articulate that to people. People are interested in coming to work with you, maybe more than you think. Like, I think if a lot of entrepreneurs are thinking this and like, oh, I can't pay like a Google salary, a Twitter salary. You can be really inspiring, and lots of people are at their Google or Twitter job thinking like, ugh, this place is driving me nuts. I'm not in love with what I'm working on, but I'm doing it to pay the bills. What other additional things or additional projects can I work on? And the reality is, if you can kind of share that vision, which you came on to this conversation like inspiring and clearly sharing your vision, if you can do that with people, they want to work with you.
I think so. I also think, again, like, people are just drawn to fixing things and solving problems. I think we live in a world in which we have spent so much time absorbing what's broken that if somebody shows up to say, hey, maybe we can go really do something together and fix things or try to fix things, I think that really resonates with a wide range of people. I mean, just thinking through the job applications we've gotten, these are people who worked in government, they've worked at tech companies, they've worked consulting firms. And yeah, to your point, these are all top-notch. I mean, absolutely top-notch people. It's kind of amazing.
We'll be right back to the conversation after a quick break. Okay, back to the show.
I want to ask you about what you said. You said it a couple times now about your love of solving hard problems. And I remember, this is something that I say. I used to say this in interviews, where it'd say, like, what are you good at? And I'd say, I like to solve hard problems. Oh, okay. And I generally think of myself that way. I heard you say this. So here's my question. Do you think you can be a successful entrepreneur and not have a love for solving hard problems?
That's a good question.
Yes. Yeah. I think you can. Actually, if anything, it's probably easier to be a successful entrepreneur if you're not motivated to solve hard problems.
Say more about that.
Why is that?
Well, because you can grift on something that's incredibly profitable and very boring, right? Like, I mean, there are so many things that are, so I don't want to like start calling things out because I'm going to get emails saying, it actually is solving a lot of hard problems to do thing X. But
okay, but just give us one example.
Oh no.
Mary Griftmas, let's go.
I know. Like, I dug this hole. I have to go wallow in it now. So I'll just give you, like, from my perspective, like, I started to build a company in responsible AI, right, before I joined Twitter. It was called Parity. And we were building software to enable companies to track and monitor their algorithms for unethical use. So now that there are a lot of laws passing, a lot of the startups that were formed around the same time, they're just shifting towards compliance, right? Compliance with the law. To me, that is boring. To me, that is boring. It is boring because I know what the answer is. So I just got to like map my software to the answer. It is not necessarily easy to solve, right? It's really hard to make the tools that do this stuff. But if I know what the answer is, then I'm like, okay, well, all I have to do is get from A to B and then just do the work to get to B. And then, like, there you go. Like,
in that scenario, what's the question? You're saying, like, if I know what the answer is. Because I was thinking the question is, how do we get people to comply with this law? Which to me, I don't know the space, but maybe that's a hard problem to solve. I don't know.
It is. Well, it can be a hard problem to solve. I think the interesting part of making a compliance platform is that no one's really told you how to get from point A to point B. Yeah. So now we have this goal of point B, which is whatever law has passed, right? But how to get there is not necessarily the solved problem, and that's what all these companies are tackling. But also, again, if we think about, like, what is this high-level mission, human flourishing, a better society, is compliance with the law getting us to a better society?
And it sounds like you want to solve not how do we get to this clearly defined what, but you want to figure out what the what is in the first place.
What is the what?
What should we be solving? Yeah. And that is like a higher tier hard problem to solve. Like, what should we be solving? And then there's the how that comes into it too. But that's actually a really interesting distinction and actually a good framework for thinking about what you're working on. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs could actually use it. So like there's most entrepreneurs are probably solving a how do we get to this outcome, but maybe it's useful to write out what is the outcome in the world that you're trying to impact, whether that's for-profit or nonprofit. Like, what's the outcome you're trying to make happen? I think for me, for example, if I think about my own business, like I want to see a lot more women, people of color, people who are not represented in tech, right? Like doing those jobs and also in entrepreneurship. So that's like the what. And I'm figuring out sort of a lot of the how. But I think there's also another layer of like hard mode of this, which is like, okay, but if there was a brand new what, that we were trying to create, what would it be? And that's what I hear your work being. Maybe it's like a framework we can use to maybe challenge ourselves to think bigger about impact.
Well, and to your point, so much of tech is built around supporting status quo.
Yeah.
And if you are any sort of a minority, right, unless you are a straight white man who speaks English and was, born in a Western country, you know that status quo is broken, right? And hopefully some of the people I mentioned also know the status quo is broken. So, back to this, like, what's a lazy way to build stuff? A lazy way to build stuff is say, I'm just going to build a thing that upholds status quo, right? So I'm going to build, a face detection system for police officers. They can go catch criminals, knowing full well that policing can be racist, that facial recognition algorithms can be racist. But we're just going to pretend like that doesn't exist. And because it's so easy to build the tech around that and make lots and lots of money selling it all over the world, you can just go build it and make lots of money. So I think it's also interesting, your question, because so much of the laziness is also tied with the unethical behavior. Because you can just be lazy and look the other way, or you can look at the problem and really try to tackle it. And it is a hard problem. And by the way I answer the question that you were, like how you answer in interviews, I always say that I enjoy making order out of chaos. One thing I realized, just like, it's great to be in your 40s, by the way, because you get to look back and like self-reflect. And I'm like, man, every time I've taken a job and every time I've left a job, there's actually a pretty simple pattern to it. I like jobs where things are undefined. I like jobs when someone says, here's just like a ball of string, like make something out of this. And I am so happy when you do that. And the minute it's like an organized thing, I'm like, oh, I'm a little bit bored now.
Yeah.
Because this is just like a self-operating machine. I just kind of have to show up and like shake some hands. And I think for most people, that's when they would be the happiest. That's when I'm the most bored.
Yeah.
And I go to the next thing that's this like difficult, like I was at Accenture for 4 years. I started off with them just giving me an idea, responsible AI. Nobody knew what, 2017, we barely knew what AI was, let alone responsible AI. And I would sit on all these panels, all these philosophers, and they're like, oh, we have to think about like Aristotle. And I'm like, no, it's okay. Like I studied Aristotle. That's actually not what we should do.
I'm good on that.
I'm good. Actually, human flourishing, the phrase does come from Aristotle, but like we're not building tech or solutions around what Aristotle said, right?
Yeah.
We're building solutions around what happens today in the real world. And a whole bunch of us who did this work shifted the entire market to start thinking about this, right? And that was really cool and fun. But then when it gets to the point where, your customers are showing up and it's, you just got to fly somewhere, shake some hands of a CEO, and then you're good, and the team just delivers the thing. Then I'm like, oh, I'm a little bit bored now.
Yeah, well, it just strikes me too that exactly what you're describing of like, it's basically the opposite of what I always hear people say about what they want from work. You're like, I love ambiguity. I don't want someone to tell me what to do. I want to find the answer myself. I would say 98% of people don't feel that way. But if you're listening to that as a listener and that just resonated and you went, oh my gosh, same.
Yeah.
And you're working for someone else, you probably shouldn't be, because you probably have that entrepreneurial spirit. Like if that hit your soul,
you're like, stop telling me exactly what to do. Let me figure out what to do.
The other thing that I'm kind of like,
slightly ungovernable is one of the best characteristics. That you just have to be like a little bit of like that person, not too much, right? Because you can't be like wholly ungovernable, but you have to be a little bit like, why are we having this meeting? Or do we need to really,
The thing is, once you're in, if you have that, a little bit of ungovernable, I have that in my soul, I think.
I think I do too.
I think what happens though is like, I have been out, now that I've stepped out into being an entrepreneur, I think I've been out of a job long enough that I don't know that I can go back to being governable enough.
There's no chance you could.
I don't know that you can hire, like I cannot have a job. I think
really
I'm unemployable at this point, but maybe that's I'm okay with it.
Same thing, right? Like, do you become unhireable? But then, like, to like think about it even in even broader sense, then what does that say about companies, right? And what does that say about corporations? In that, once we've sort of tasted the outside and what autonomy really means and what it means to choose what we do and forge our own paths, even on an aligned mission, that we feel like, whether or not it is true, we feel like if we went back to this environment, that we would be stifled. Like, I think that actually it speaks about us, but I don't think we're very different from most human beings. I think human beings from a very young age get institutionalized and socialized to behave in institutions. And then once we break out, you're like, but I'm capable of so much more.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things that, to think about, and again, back to like, why a nonprofit? What does it look like to tackle something that is like, okay, well, what does it look like to make an organization where people can feel that freedom and that ownership of what they do in tandem with other people who feel that way, right? So it's not about making like cogs in a machine. It's about making an organization where everybody does better together. So it's more like Voltron and a little bit less like a clock.
Okay, so I have a question. I was going to position the question as like advice you would give to a hypothetical entrepreneur, but instead I'm going to selfishly ask for myself. Because I think what you're doing is you're building this, like you're kind of outlining next levels to the video game, the entrepreneurship video game, which is kind of like easy mode is you can solve something that's like, it's not a big hairy problem. It's not like, it's kind of just like a how do we make this thing happen? Maybe it's not even how, it's just like how do we maintain a status quo, as you worded it. That's kind of like a first level. There's another level, which is like, okay, I want to shake up the status quo, but we kind of know what end result we're trying to get to. It's just kind of how. And then there's kind of a third level, which is where you're playing, which is like, we don't even know what this is going to look like or what we're going after or the how. We're still trying to figure out all of that. That actually gave me a good framework for myself of like, what could be next in my career. I think for myself, though, the thing that like is pulling me back from what you're saying is like the kind of the part about like, well, we got to pay the bills piece.
Yeah.
Right. So for myself, I feel like, and maybe it's like a sequential thing. It's not like a one and done. So I feel like there's an element of maybe the level 2 of figuring out the how that I'm super interested in, how to get to this next future. And that tends to maybe lend itself to a for-profit model. We're not like figuring out the what. But then after that, I can totally imagine myself in my career being like, okay, I did that. I cashed out of that. Now I want to work on the next thing, which is figuring out the big, hairy why and what, like, where are we going? And so my question to you is if someone's thinking about this kind of video game that you're outlining, these levels of trajectory and career, for myself even, how do you think one could not get stuck in the comfort of level 1 or level 2? Right, figuring out how to do status quo and making a lot of money, that's good, but like you get stuck there. You can also get stuck at the next level.
I love this question.
How do I not get stuck?
I love this.
This is such a, so then there's two things you made me think of. One is that I think everybody wants to jump into hard mode right away, and that's the worst thing to do, right? There is a lot of value to doing grunt work, right? Like I did not wake up and know how to do, like I had plenty of like absolutely terrible internships, entry-level grunt work, et cetera. And all of that teaches you something, right?
Yeah.
Having to build a practice at Accenture, which is a very structured firm, has like a very specific way of doing things, taught me things. Being at Twitter taught me things. So it's not that those experiences were useless, but they all, and to one of the questions you asked earlier, there are things you learn that you like to do and not like to do. Yeah. So jumping right into hard mode, you're almost guaranteed to fail because you have no idea. You don't even know who you are yet, how you operate, what your mission is. You may think you know what your mission is, but you might not. Right. And you might not until you have tried and failed in many different ways. So it's not even just about like paying the bills. I think it's actually about also just having those baseline skills and those experiences such that like when I talk to people at Google and Microsoft, et cetera, I understand how they do their jobs. So I'm better able to relate to them and align with them as a nonprofit partner. Because like if I had never worked at a company like that, I'd have no idea how they operate. And now I do. And that helps me. So I think one part of it is there's so much to learn and people should not discount, even doing the quote easy stuff because it's still not easy, right? It's not easy to build and scale a company, even if you're just like, selling cookies or whatever, right?
What really resonated with me about what you were saying, though, is that like, learning the industry, but also learning about yourself. You said earlier, like 40 feels really good. Yeah. I am not 40. I'm in my 30s, but I feel that way about like moving from 20s to 30s. Like there's an extra level of just like confidence and knowing myself. Yeah. I'm like, ooh, this feels good. Especially and I'm looking forward to like 40. Yeah. I'm looking forward really to 60. I'm looking forward to like my gray locks and like the kind of like swag and wisdom and confidence and knowing myself.
Swag and wisdom and confidence. I love it.
I can't wait.
But can I ask though? I would love to ask a follow up from the standpoint of, for you personally, was it your intuition that was telling you, you've used this phrase several times, I was bored. And to me, I'm thinking if you're getting bored, that's the sign that it's time to level up. Because you could be an engineer at Meta and not be bored. But when you do feel like you reach the point that, like, is that the feeling that you would point to is like, that's when your intuition is telling you it's time to go? Or is there anything else in that decision for you that told you it was time?
Yeah, and actually this ties into the second half of the question you had just asked, which was about like, how do you prevent yourself from getting stuck? So one of the things that I know about myself, my biggest fear in life is being stagnant. I actually fear nothing else. The thing I fear the most is just becoming very complacent with things. So there's a few ways to not become that. One is to always have something you're really bad at doing. Just like whatever, anything. It could be like running, you hate it, you're awful at it. Good, go do it some more. Remind yourself that there are things you can achieve. But also in doing so, you build this reflex for learning and achieving. And so all of the smartest people I've ever known, have you ever known people like, they're just good at like everything. They like play an instrument. They run marathons. They're like a really successful whatever. And it's because they've kind of cracked that code of achievement. Everything can be broken down into like digestible tasks, and you just go and you proceed. So it's good to remind yourself, like if you think you're good at everything, then you're doing something wrong, right? So then to kind of go to like the maybe you're not bored, right? So once I get bored when I feel like I've unlocked the formula, like, oh, I get how this works now, right? If you're somebody who is like somewhat observant of macro level trends and institutions and how things work, you can like take a step back and be like, oh, this is how the factory works, right? Like this is just how this moves. And if I move this, that'll move there. And then that's when I kind of get bored because I'm like, I know how to work this system. But you could be in an institution or a place that is forever interesting to you. That is like that. Like that is actually the ultimate achievement in life. It is not necessarily that you have to like level up to this level 3. You may reach that level of just feeling intellectually stimulated or curious, constantly challenging yourself, solving new problems, sitting at Facebook. Like honestly, so happy for you. Like if that is the case, like that is amazing. And frankly, companies should be like that. Like there are so many people who are genuinely smart and then they chafe against the roles that they're in because they feel boxed in. How could we make organizations or corporations, and corporations would do better if they did this, that can really tap into that, let people be exploratory. I mean, if you think about what drew so many people to tech, I think like tech today is so different from tech like 20 years ago. And I remember like Google used to give you Fridays to do whatever you wanted because they knew they were attracting the best and brightest. So once money is taken care of, right? Because they're paying them well. Once everything else is taken care of, what do they need to keep them there is intellectual stimulation. So if they said to the smartest people, do whatever you want on Fridays, what they knew for sure people would do is just tackle really hard tasks related to their jobs. And it's stuff that their manager would have never thought of, the CEO would have never thought of, right? Like that spirit.
That's how like
of
Gmail and a whole bunch of products that they have came about. Yeah,
that's right. And like whether or not they worked, sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Like Google's sort of notorious for launching things and killing them. Actually, I kind of love that though. Like it's fine. Launch stuff and then it won't work. Then you get rid of it. Then you do something else. Most successful entrepreneurs you'll ever talk to will say something like, "This is my 3rd startup. This is my 4th startup." Right? It's kind of like the iceberg where you see the tip and you don't see everything else that was under the water. So these people, a whole bunch of times, they learned stuff, they figured stuff out, they got okay with failing, and then they made the thing that made them famous.
This resonates with me. I started my career in tech working on a Google project that failed. Google had tried to buy Groupon. The deal didn't go through, and so they're like, fine, we'll build our own. And it was called Google Offers, and so that was my first role in tech, was working at Google Offers. And I actually think I learned a lot about the like try and fail piece, but also about what you're saying about the importance of intellectual stimulation at work. And I think that answer of like kind of, I was asking like, how do you not get stuck? I think what I'm hearing you say is like, you kind of have to ask yourself, how intellectually stimulated am I right now? And you've got to kind of build your life around continuing to have that intellectual stimulation, which I love that we have somehow arrived back at a Maslow's hierarchy of needs conversation, which is my jam.
And I would add, like, not just for yourself, but also for the team that you're building. And like, if you're keeping that in mind of, okay, you're attracting top talent, keeping them probably doesn't come down to paying them top dollar necessarily, but building an environment where they feel like they have that intellectual freedom and curiosity to work on hard problems, and that they want to be working on hard problems with you.
So I want to bring our listeners or watchers, viewers into this conversation. So I'm curious if we can all do a little like self-audit. We can do this in our conversation, but if you want to, you can put this in the comments. Like if you come to YouTube, we can see what everybody's commenting. So I'd love for you to give us a score, a number 1 through 5, on how intellectually stimulated do you feel in your life right now? Ooh, 1 is like really low, 5 is like maximum intellectual stimulation in terms of what's going on in your life right now. We can do a little audit. There's no like right or wrong answer, but I'm curious to see where everyone is. Katie, what's your number?
I feel like I've been at like a 3. And I'm currently figuring out how do I get back to like a 4 or a 5.
Got it.
And I think the reason I say that is
you
because
used to be at a 4 or a 5.
Yes, I think I've gotten to your point about you kind of learn how the machine works. You understand if I push this lever, this will happen. I think I am getting to that place now in parts of the business. And I'm starting to get curious again about how do we now try something different, and how do we start to ask maybe more interesting questions about what we're trying to do here long term, so that we're not just kind of, recreating the wheel.
Rumman, what about you?
I'm like a solid 9 at the moment. So it's funny, you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I was joking with a friend of mine because the space of AI is just constant like brain overload.
Yeah.
I was joking with a friend of mine who's at Meta. She's amazing, one of my favorite people. We were joking that we have a reverse Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where every hour on the half hour, we talk about, will AI end humanity? How do we create AI that's anti-racist? How do we solve these we don't have time to like go get a lunch.
The esoteric questions.
Right. It's so like we have the opposite of like we have literally the flip hierarchy. Where like we don't have time to feed ourselves. But also it's like we gotta fly to Brussels because the EU Parliament is deciding the AI Act, which talks about whether humans will be protected. Like, well, that's just like a Monday.
Yeah, but that's a good way to know that your food needs, for example, are met, because you can kind of take it for granted. Like, I'll get it later. Like, I can get it at any point. I gotta focus on this other stuff.
But that being said, like being hangry, like so the people in my community almost suffer from the opposite, where it's like we need to take better care of ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also like kind of to build on what we've been saying, I think we're talking a lot about like getting intellectual stimulation, et cetera, from work. I think it's totally fine if you get that from home. Like a lot of mothers get intellectual stimulation out of, like raising a good family, and then they work and like the job is not the thing. The job pays the bills. Or maybe a lot of dads feel that way too, right? There are other things you can do that don't have to just be attached to what your job is. So I think it's just like, to be very holistic about it, to be a good whole person, you just kind of have to figure out, where are you getting that from? Yeah. And if it is not work, is it somewhere else? And if it's not somewhere, you have to get it from somewhere.
Yeah. So I think I was meaning in life, but maybe folks can in the comments give us like 2 numbers, 1 where you are in life and 1 where you are in work, and we can kind of see. Are you doing a 1 through 10 scale? Out of 10?
No, I was doing 1 through 5, and I'm straight up at a 9.
Okay.
I'm just like, look, my day started at 7, thinking through what I just said about like going to Brussels and thinking through, and then I'm like, we got to go to Shanghai and think about, Chinese and American relations as it relates to AI. And it's like, this is like literally not meant to be a flex, because sometimes it is overwhelming. Yeah. One of the reasons I have the nonprofit is there needs to be more people doing this work. Like it's flattering to be considered one, but we can't always be those people. Like there needs to be a next generation of people that does this work. There needs to be different perspectives and people who disagree with me who do this work as well. So one of the problems that I'm actually solving is bringing more people into doing this work, because it is this amazing mix of, it is intellectually stimulating, it is problem solving, and it can actually pay your bills and be profitable depending on where you end up and what you do.
Yeah. You said it's a 9, not to be a flex, but I actually think the biggest flex of what you've said this whole time, which there have been multiple great flexes, by the way, was that I said, like, score yourself on a scale of 1 through 5, and you were like, a 9. Like, I think it's a really good way to kind of close out this conversation, because that demonstrates the way that you are willing to think, which is screw your framework. I'm thinking of my own. And that, I think, is really the kind of mindset you have to think to be playing at that like level 3, that hard mode of like, well, let's figure out what we're even solving for. Let me try a new framework. Let me try some new things. Like, I think that's a really good example of the way that you think and the way that you're approaching things. And it's a good thing that maybe we can all model and kind of take pieces from and learnings from. Screw the framework. Maybe a more intellectually stimulating, maybe harder way to do this, which hard in a fun way, is to go like, well, what other frameworks can I use? And what other kind of structures can I use? I get to make it up myself.
Yeah. I have so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun.
Yeah, it was amazing.